Today we're talking about a uniquely Latin concept in language called the ablative absolute. In order to understand what kind of phrase the ablative absolute is, we're going to look at a phrase that you already know how to translate. We're going to look at an old type of phraseology from many, many stages ago. We're going to talk specifically about cum clauses. They were relatively easy for you. There was a cum clause at the beginning of a sentence. The cum clause used a subjunctive verb, and in the cum clause, the content of it provided the circumstance for the rest of the sentence. So, under what circumstance did the indicative verb action happen? Example number 1. Senex cum pecuniam invenisset ad villam laetus rediit. The old man, when he had found the money, returned to the house happy. The cum clause started at cum and went to invenisset when he had found the money. So it provides the circumstance for which he went home happy. Otherwise, he would not have gone home happy. Or you would have said, why did he go home happy? And then we would have needed the cum clause to explain it. In the second example, we have cum custodes dormierent, fures e carcere effugerunt. When the guards were sleeping, the thieves fled from the prison. In this phrase, the thieves fled from the prison under a certain circumstance, which is when the guards happened to be sleeping. Because of these examples and the way that cum clauses work, you might remember that cum clauses are something called dependent clauses. They're dependent on something else in the sentence to make sense. They have a subject, they have a verb, but they cannot be independent. They can't be on their own. In every cum clause, the verb was also a subjunctive one, and that was to alert the reader to the fact that that action was not happening independently, and it could not stand on its own. So we're going to talk now about a phrase that is also dependent, and that phrase is our new phrase. It's called an ablative absolute. An ablative absolute phrase is dependent on the rest of the sentence in order to make sense. This type of phrase also uses a non-standard type of verb that will not be used alone. However, an ablative absolute phrase will not use a subjunctive verb in the same way that a cum clause did. Instead, the ablative absolute will always include a noun and a participle. Both the noun and the participle will be in the ablative case, and an ablative absolute phrase will most likely take place at the beginning of a sentence, and it'll set the stage or tell you about the circumstance under which the rest of the sentence took place. Let's check out some examples from the model sentences. Die illuciscente, multi sacarii in ripa fluminis laborabant. When the day was dawning, the dock workers were working on the bank of the river. Nave delegata sacarii fermentum exponere coeperunt. After the ship was tied up, the dock workers began to unload the grain. Both of these sentences start with an ablative absolute phrase. This da is a noun with an ablative case ending, and then here you have a participle, specifically a present participle, with an ablative case ending. For this phrase, nave delegata, nave is a third declension noun, so this is its ablative ending, and delegata is a perfect passive participle, which takes its endings from the first and second declension, which means that a with a macron is the ablative ending as well. You might have noticed something, and that is that when I translated these ablative absolute phrases, I actually did not start my translation with the noun, nor did I start my translation with the participle. In fact, that's a really important rule to translating an ablative absolute phrase. When you recognize that you're dealing with an ablative absolute phrase, you will never start your translation with one of the Latin words. So what are you going to start with? I'm sure that question is on your mind right now. Swab. This is a mnemonic device to remember all the words that you can use to start a translation of an ablative absolute phrase. since you cannot start with one of the Latin ones. You could use since, when, while, after, or because, the letters for which spell out swab, which is just awkward enough to hopefully stick in your brain. So, all right, you pick one of the words from swab. There's a little bit of flexibility as to which word you can pick depending on what's happening in the rest of the sentence. But then what do? After swab, you're going to translate the participle as though it's a, quote, real verb. All right? You want to make sure that the action is commensurate to the type of participle. So the translation must include the basic elements. So present participles, when they're part of an ablative absolute phrase, you must translate them with blanking in the translation somewhere. It could be are blanking, was blanking, something like that. With a perfect passive participle, you want to keep it in the perfect tense, so in the past, and then you want to keep it passive, as in the noun that's in the ablative absolute phrase did not do the action, were or had been blanked. And in the rare case of a perfect active participle, being part of an ablative absolute phrase, you want to indicate that the noun blanked. Either way, no matter how the participle gets translated, the noun that's in the ablative absolute phrase will get translated first because that's the subject of the participle. In the same way that in a cum clause, you had a subject of the subjunctive verb. So this is the difference between how to use the various types of participles in an ablative absolute phrase. Sacariis laborantibus, while the dock workers are working. You could also, depending on the context of the rest of the sentence, you could say while the dock workers were working. A perfect passive participle, again, starts with the noun, but then it makes sure that the verb happened to the noun and it already happened in the past, after the ship has been tied up. A perfect active participle, again, starts with the noun in the translation, and then the participle is something that the noun did, since the dock workers had left. All three translations start with swab. This one is while, this one is after, this one is since. All three translations feature the noun that's in the ablative absolute phrase first, and then features the participle afterwards, because the participle is really being used as a basic verb form. There are three main takeaways for you about the ablative absolute. Number one, an ablative absolute phrase must have a noun and a participle. Number two, the noun and the participle must be in the ablative case. And for what it's worth, you're not going to find a noun that's in the ablative case at the beginning of the sentence, and then a participle that's in the ablative case, 4, 5, 6 words away somewhere else in the sentence. And you're not going to have to assume that they go together. The ablative absolute words will be in close relationship to each other within the phrase. And then the final thing that you really need to take away from the ablative absolute is that when you translate an ablative absolute phrase, you are not starting with either of the two Latin words that are given to you within the ablative absolute phrase. This is where swab comes in. I have 6 examples here, and one of the reasons that I chose to provide so many examples is because when you're starting an ablative absolute translation with swab, there's a lot of flexibility that you have with translation. For pecunia inventa, the translation I gave you is because the money was found, but you could just as easily say since the money was found, or after the money was found. You have to start being a little bit flexible with the ablative absolute. Now, some Latin students don't really like being too flexible, so be cautious about that. Modesto militarente, while Modestus was serving in the army. Puella epistulam scribente, when the girl was writing the letter. Cena consumta, when dinner had been eaten. Re confecta, after the thing was finished. And militibus vulneratis, since the soldiers were wounded. Credits for the slideshow, and we'll work on this in class tomorrow. See you later.